It was once a hugely thriving ecosystem. We couldn't have cleaned it out anymore had we tried.
It would be mad to assume that towing a heavy metal dredge over any of these habitats wasn't going to have a degrading effect on it.
It's kind of heartbreaking to think that my boys might live to see a time when the seas are barren or close to it.
The smallest of the trawlers have been squeezed the hardest and have probably got the worst of it, of all the fishermen. I think the problem doesn't so much lie with trawlers or dredgers, it lies with fisheries management.
Imagine a limit around the whole of the coastline. It would just be a massive step forward.
My dad is a fisherman, and fishermen, no matter how they fish or where they fish, they're all going to be judged by history in the same light.
It's just a breathtaking world, really. You step into the icy water, you submerge, and it's just a totally new world that opens up around you. There's kelp forests tangled in knots that ebb and flow with the tide. There's octopuses crawling around on the seabed. Do you know what? It's really scary how quickly these underwater worlds are being destroyed, along with the fish that depend on them. And most of the time, no one even knows that it's happening.
I've been diving Loch Carron for 15, 16 years, and so I know the area, I know what sort of animals are here, and I know how beautiful flame shells in particular are. It's 2017, a marine biologist who's local to the area, and she had seen a scallop dredger dredging right in this side of Plockton, quite close to where we are sitting just now, over an area where there's known to be a flame shell. He's got these gorgeous iron blue coloured tentacles. They're very fragile systems and yet really, really important. So myself and a few colleagues, we managed to get together a few days later. When we first dived down, we're expecting to see, hoping to see a healthy flame shell reef. Having dived it many times before, you know full well how many species rely on it and depend on it and live in it, live on it, feed in it. It was quite distressing. It was utterly destroyed.
At times they don't recognize all the artisanal fishermen. Because they see they have the advantage. When they come around, sometimes they come around at night, midnight, using a single light to do their fish. But even if we try to signal them or call their attention, nobody will pay attention to us. No one will respond to us. So they will work and not damaging our materials and get what they want to get on the sea and go. It's a drag net. So when they are dragging, I'm on, and my net is a station net, station one place. So as they are dragging, coming to my direction, I will be signaling them if I see them. But some distance, we'll leave our net in the water and come on shore. So behind us in the net, they will come around, do their fishing. If I'm bad lucky, they will drag my net. And the next morning if I go there, I will not see my net. I will end up losing. The next time, if even I carry another net on that spot, I will not get no catch. Compared to the first time, I will not go and challenge them. They have wild equipment and are. So we end up leaving the area. Sometimes we'll go to them, even beg them for eating fish. You see thousands of small fish are they're wasting on the beach. Each of them, each one of it can born another 1,000, but it's dead. So the water is getting broke gradually from that catch.
So, welcome everybody. We're really excited to be here live in Glasgow for a special edition from COP26 Tukitelu. Welcome to everybody joining us online as well. So for those of you that haven't joined a Tukitelu event before, Tukitelu means 3 stones in Malagasy. It's a Malagasy proverb that talks about the fact that you need more than one person, you need 3 people to come together in order to hold the pot above the stove. So it's a symbolic of the fact that you need a holistic approach, you need more ideas, more thoughts coming in so that you can build a better solution. So everybody online joining through AirMeet, you have the chat function available to you and the Q&A box. And you should also have the option to listen in French using Interprify. If you have any questions on that, please drop a message in the chat and the tech team will try and sort that out for you. Just a reminder that this obviously is a public event, so please be kind and thoughtful in your comments. We're keen for a lively discussion, but please be mindful of what you're saying. So we have a few presentations for you today, followed by a Q&A session. And then those of you online will move into some breakout sessions. And those of you in the room, we can stay and have a chat, talk through the discussions over a drink. So we get the better option. Great. So we're going to start, having had that lovely video just to set the scene, with another short film, which is a really positive example of how bottom trawl bans can work in practice. So we're going to go to Belize, where 10 years ago they implemented a bottom trawl ban within their full EEZ. And this was a collaboration between government, NGO, and the fishing industry, which was supported by Oceana. So a series of videos that are reflections on that ban have been recorded and then they'll be released over the next couple of weeks. But we're going to start now with a short taste of a video to show you how things could work, maybe in an ideal world.
I grew up on an island. All my life I've been on an island. I think I was one of the first all-girls fisher here in Dangriga because I fished with 2 of my cousins and that was my part-time job after school. So that's my thing and I haven't left the sea from then.
Basically, myself, I'm a fisherman from original and I have my family with my beautiful wife Veronica and my kids. That's what we do for a living, no?
My history in fishing, I take it as adventure. That's something I love. I don't think I would change that for anything else. Some of my friends I say, girl, that work that for man, not for lady. You need to stay home and get your nails pretty up. If I stay home, I got my nails pretty up in hour. Pay me nothing.
Well, they used to have a lot of fish, although they used to use the seine. Because one of my mother's uncles used to have a seine, Valencia. Mr. Valencia does have a crew of eight persons, sometimes 6. They went like 4 o'clock in the morning to seine. And by 6 o'clock, these guys are in the market already. The sea does have very, very, very well fish.
First time I got on a key when I'm 10. And I like it. We went to fish it net the first time when I got on a key check. And when we gone, the man tell me if I come take the boat out of the lagoon. And I drive the boat out of the lagoon, I got so I learn about fishing and I teach all of my leave them about the game. Fuck, me excited, dog. Adrenaline in rush. I tell her, I can't stop. From then till now, I can't stop.
Well, trawlers, when they were here, I was still fishing around here. I was doing fishing. They used to go by jetty and stay there, and they never was used to allow us to go on board. They don't want to see us. They don't want us to see their catches, what they do out there. But then, when we go on fishing in canoes, you can see a string of silk snappers that they dump. Other fishes that they don't want, they float on top of the sea that the birds they can't even eat. That's what the trawlers they do here. Fish got scarce. Fish got scarce here.
My thing about that, they really affected because that was right here in the front. And right here in the front we have, you'll say, the badas that we have here. And we have the dory guys that don't have a skiff like I do, so they get in their little paddle canoes and they'll paddle out and fish. But when the trawlers was there, that's the area they were wrecking. And now we have the shrimp certain time in abundance. You can go right there in the water walking and you'll feel them on your feet. And sometimes we go with the cast nets, cast a little and go home and have some nice shrimp. When the trawler was there, you didn't have that. Because everything is in the net, the small, the big, the lobster, the shrimp, the fishes. There's no, the net doesn't say, I don't want you stay on that side or take you out. When that comes in that boat, everything that is in the way gets in that net and it's in the boat.
Yeah, my family work on fish boat. We just go on fish boat the time when we just go there. We see hill of fucking shrimp. Shrimp like what hill, what truckload hill, you know. I tell you what truckload hill. Wait for there. Then we got a lot of boat. Wait for there, the tongue, wait by there. Lot of boat. Double cabin, triple cabin. And everybody just had a lot of fish check. Wow. 2010 they just banned me. To me, I feel a way because they banned me because I done with, you know. If they never ban it, but they ban it, check dog. So the trawling, why it does bring paper in the country, dog. It does bring paper, we does catch everything. Everything. They might catch cobia, snapper, all the pequeño, they might catch the pequeño, the big one, the small one, seahorse. Everything, kind of anything they right up on the mud, check. Now we could find seahorse, right there the key. Right underneath the mango. You don't have to go nowhere, you will find it right there.
When they trial, I used to go up on the strange boat itself, and I say kind of fish. I say kind of different, like the squid, the small snapper from the rock, the corals, they bring up the sea turtles, and so they kill a lot of things, but they kill everything. The rake and scrape.
Sets the scene really nicely, I think, for why we're here today. So my name is Sophie Bembo. I'm the head of marine at Fauna and Flora International, and I'm here with you today representing the Transformed Bottom Trawling Coalition. So can we get the slides up? So yeah, just to talk a little bit more, I guess, about why we're here and what we'd like to talk about. We're talking about whether bottom trawling can be part of a zero carbon future. Next slide, please. So we know, and it is widely recognized, that bottom trawling is an inherently and highly destructive fishing method, but it is completely normalized as a part of our seafood production chain. A recent report came out published by the Bottom Trawling Coalition, which aims to summarize some of the particular climate impacts of bottom trawling. And if you go to the next slide, there's a really nice infographic that's also in front of you if you're here in the room with us. And it pulls up some really quite astonishing statistics. So more than 19 million tons of seafood is landed by trawled fisheries every year, and this is nearly a quarter of all marine landings. And we now know that there is an impact on the climate as a result of this. Trawling is disturbing marine sediment, and we're looking to better understand the carbon release from that at the moment. There's a lot of science going into that process. Another kind of key output from this report, to my mind, is that the carbon footprint of bottom trawled seafood is high. Not quite as high as beef for cow, but it is extremely high. And it means that seafood is not always a very kind of environmentally friendly way to eat if you're eating bottom trawled produce. Next slide, please. So in terms of why... so there's another report that's coming out in the next couple of weeks, which is looking to be a really sound scientific evidence base on bottom trawling. It's looking to assess the what of trawling, what is it, Also, where is it? Where are the key hotspots of trawling that we might want to try and address some solutions around? And really also trying to pull out some potential constructive paths forward. So trying to provide some indication of what the solution might be if we're to transition away from such a widely used method. So this led to the launch of the Transform Bottom Trawling Coalition. This was launched on the 6th of September at the IUCN World Conservation Congress. It's a grouping of currently 47 organizations that have come together, and it's developed 4 main calls to action. These were developed collaboratively by reaching out to and receiving input from over 120 relevant organizations. Next slide, please. And the 4 calls to action are hopefully fairly simple, but they are quite ambitious. So firstly, we would look to expand and strengthen nearshore exclusion zones for small-scale fisheries and move trawling slightly further off the coast. Secondly, we would look to prohibit bottom trawling within marine protected areas. We had the really nice example from Belize, but for example, in the UK, trawling is allowed in more than 95% of our MPAs. So even in the UK, we have a lot of work to do on this issue, and we've got some panelists that will be speaking to exactly that in a moment. The third call to action is around ending subsidies for bottom trawling in particular. There is a lot of research and calculations going into this, and it basically indicates that if subsidies were removed, bottom trawling would no longer be profitable. And the fourth call to action is around freezing the footprint. So making sure that if there are pristine or untrawled areas of the seabed out there, that we can stop them being trawled so that we can limit the trawling impact, because it's not going to stop tomorrow. There is going to be some kind of transition process. If we can make sure that we limit the impact of that as much as we possibly can. And that's all from me. I'm going to invite our first panelist. So I'm really pleased that we're joined by Bally Philps. He is a Scottish fisherman. He's also the president of the Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation. And he's going to be talking to us today about your work. Over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm a full-time commercial fisherman fishing with creels off the west coast of Scotland. I come from a family of trawl and dredge fishermen. I was the first black sheep in my family to turn my back on trawling and dredging, and hopefully I'm qualified enough to talk about this. Got some slides here, hopefully. Cheers. So yes, I had a trawler friend recently ask me a question. I do still have a couple of trawler friends left. A trawler friend asked me a question: why are we singling out trawling and dredging? And I thought I would try and address that. So I think you've all probably heard of a recent study about the aviation industry having a similar carbon footprint possibly to the trawling sector. Now that's a disputed study. The figures are disputed, but I think the general consensus is that there's a good chance that the carbon footprint of trawling is quite significant. Now, I'm not sure how quick these slides are changing. Okay, so we think if the carbon footprint is even half as significant as these studies are showing, what we could find ourselves is that instead of acting as they have for millennia, that the sea lochs of Scotland could, instead of being carbon sinks, be some of our most significant sources of carbon. And I think that's quite a significant impact that we could be finding ourselves with. Now, one of the reasons I think this is so important is that Scotland isn't counting its blue carbon. So the carbon that's coming from these trawlers that these studies have been referring to isn't even mentioned in our carbon budgets. And if it turns out that this is the most significant source of carbon in Scotland, or one of the most significant, then that's a significant thing not to be counting. Now, one of the reasons this is so significant is that Scotland's sea areas are huge. And as was mentioned earlier, the trawling footprint is something like the vast majority of this thing's only excluded from a few percent of Scotland's inshore. So again, if we're disturbing all of these sediments, then this could be a very big blind spot in our carbon budgets. Now, carbon is estimated to be the majority of carbon in Scotland. It dwarfs the terrestrial carbon from all of our peat, our topsoils, and our living trees put together. Now, it's worth noting that carbon exists in two principal forms. That's the sort of inorganic carbon, which we're not really going to be talking about here, but mostly what we're interested in is the organic carbon. And that's living things, biogenic reefs, and the animals and fish that are in the sea, and also the sediments that are in the seabed, which can come from a combination of the living things and being washed down from the peat in our hills. Now, one of the things about this carbon is it's quite easily disturbed, and this is one of the mechanisms by which it's disturbed. Now, when we tow gear across the seabed, whether it's dredge or trawl, it not only interacts with the life that's on the seabed, it also interacts with the sediments. And it can have quite a dramatic impact. I mean, we can remove pretty much all of the life in the same way as you might harrow or plough a field, and it leaves us only with sediments to be disturbed. Now, this is an interesting map here. It shows where the organic footprint is or the organic carbon is, I should say, around Scotland's coastline. And you'll notice, apart from a blob out in the middle of the North Sea in the flooding grounds, much of the organic carbon in Scotland seas is in the inshore. Up until recently, a lot of this carbon wasn't touched by trawling and dredging because there was an inshore exclusion zone on mobile gear in Scotland. Now, there was a study done recently by the Scottish Government, so that's this image on the right, and that shows the one of the frightening things here is that the disturbance map correlates almost exactly with where the carbon is in Scotland seas. Now, it's not an accident. What's happening is that the prawns that the trawlers are targeting live in the mud, and so therefore they're disturbing the mud, and the scallops that the dredgers are seeking are in the shallower biogenic reef areas, again, where we have a lot of our organic carbon. So I think the change in our ecosystem could be quite significant, and this maybe illustrates some of the changes that we've seen in our ecosystem. This is a graph showing the demersal fish landings in the Clyde Sea area since 1960. Each colour represents a fish species. Now, each fish species has a story of its own to tell, but the important thing to note here is that every fish species story ends the same way. That is commercial extinction by the turn of the century. Now, this is a relatively well-known fact. This is Marine Scotland's own map, Scottish Government's own map. And in 2010, Marine Scotland said that they would do something about this, and they undertook to protect what was left and recover. Now, the kind of things that they were looking to protect and recover weren't just these demersal commercial fish species. They were also looking to recover and protect the priority marine features in the ecosystem. This is one of these priority marine features. This is a flame shell, and flame shells make up reefs, biogenic reefs, which cover the bottom of the seabed and stabilize the seabed. They also sequester carbon in the process of doing so. Now, unfortunately, since Marine Scotland said that they were going to protect these environments, we've lost as much as 50% of our flame shell reefs from Argyll alone. This is a serpulid reef. This is one of Scotland's most rare reef environments. We've only got one example of serpulid reefs left in the whole of Scotland. Unfortunately, in the time since Marine Scotland said they would protect these and recover these kind of environments, we've lost 90% of our serpulid reefs in the Highlands alone. And this is a blue mussel bed. In the Moray Firth, we've lost over 90% of our blue mussel bed since Marine Scotland said that they would protect these habitats. Now, the problem with this is these figures are quite stark, but they're only the last 10 years. If we go back to pre-trawl baselines, then we have to imagine the kind of losses that we have had in the time that trawling's been allowed inshore. Now, Marine Scotland and the Scottish Government has committed itself to something called the ecosystems approach, which means that they should be looking at these pre-trawl baselines. And so if we take one example here, like seagrass, which is very good at sequestering carbon, we've lost something like 90% of our seagrass to the best of our knowledge since pre-trawl baselines. Now, there's an interesting map here, which is the priority marine features that we know of that are left around Scotland's coastline. There's two colours here. So each dot represents a flame shell reef or a seagrass environment or a blue mussel bed or such like. So the green dots are meant to be areas where we have some protection for these priority marine features. And although we should understand that some of that protection is temporal, which means for 2 months a year or 6 months a year, so they're not particularly well protected. The red dots are areas where the priority marine features are not protected at all. And what that means is that you're perfectly legally entitled to go and dredge and trawl away these features into oblivion tomorrow. This is despite the fact that 10 years ago, Marine Scotland said it was going to undertake to protect and recover these features. Now, it's quite frustrating because if Marine Scotland did what it said it was going to do, then and it looked at these priority marine features and included the pre-trawl baselines, what you would have is a continuous zone right around the coastline of Scotland where trawling and dredging wouldn't be allowed, because to be honest with you, you can't protect these features without prohibiting trawling and dredging where they are. Now, we at the Scottish Keel Fishermen's Federation have been arguing for a lot of years, amongst many others, that if we transition towards low-impact fisheries inshore, we could increase employment and revive our coastal communities as well as protect these priority marine features. We're not the only ones arguing this. There are examples of this around the world. This is an example in Lyme Bay in England, where they've excluded trawling and dredging, and they're seeing huge increases in employment and revenues and recovery of the ecosystems there. So what we're saying is that one of the biggest contributions that Scotland can make to meet the challenges of the biodiversity and the climate crisis is to introduce with urgency a prohibition on bottom towed fishing gears in Scotland's inshore waters. And the real question that remains is, are the Scottish Government willing to do what they committed themselves to doing 10 years ago?
Thank you. Perfectly to time. Great. Thank you so much, Vali. It's fascinating to have that insight with the industry perspective as well. I think that's really valuable. But also slightly stark and very depressing. So now we're going to hear from Jenny Crockett. So she represents the community of Arran Seabed Trust, or COAST. So this is a small Scottish NGO that has been trialling a solution and has implemented a marine protected area that has pushed trawling slightly further off the coast. So Jenny, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully this works. Thanks, Sophie, for the introduction. So I run the outreach and communications for the community of Arran Seabed Trust, or COAST as it's known. And we are a marine conservation charity based on the Isle of Arran. Making no presumptions, the Isle of Arran is off the west coast of Scotland and is situated within the Clyde Marine region and the Clyde Sea still. Historically, the Firth of Clyde was an important fisheries area for Scotland, with a very well-known herring fishery within its seas. But sadly, as Bally touched on, we witnessed a catastrophic decline from the mid-1980s with the repealing of the 1984 inshore limit. And this decline in our fish species and the destruction of our inshore habitats was witnessed by COAST's co-founders, Howard Wood and Don McNeish. They observed this. They're local scuba divers, no marine, they weren't marine biologists, but they just witnessed what was happening, and they realized it wasn't right. And they were inspired to protect the rich fishing heritage of their inshore waters for the future generations. And therefore, they founded COAST. Today, COAST are an education and research charity, and we're also a campaigning body, campaigning for real change in the way Scotland's inshore seas are managed. So back in 1995, Howard and Don set out to speak to anyone and everyone who would listen about the potential of bringing in a marine reserve into waters around Arran. And they were particularly focusing on this area here in Lamlash Bay, and they wanted a marine reserve to protect what was there. They obviously lobbied government, they worked with a number of different organisations and stakeholders, basically anyone who had a stake in our seas, from fishermen to locals to community businesses. And in 2008, Marine Scotland and Nature Scot established the Lamlash Bay no-take zone, a 2.67 square kilometre area, what it says on the tin. You can't extract any marine life from this area. It's the only community-led no-take zone in the UK, and it's the only no-take zone in Scotland. Today, the no-take zone sits within the much wider marine protected area, which is a 280 square kilometre area around the south of Arran. Scallop dredging is prohibited from the entirety of the marine protected area, and prawn trawling is allowed in 3 small outside zones. Obviously, the no-take zone remains the no-take zone, and there's a few areas where creel fishing is also prohibited because there's particularly sensitive habitats that are in these areas. Now, the MPA was designated for priority marine features. It's a nature conservation MPA, so it was designated for things like merle, seagrass, and burrowed mud. It wasn't designated to protect blue carbon habitats, but a lot of these priority marine features are blue carbon habitats. They retain carbon in their systems and help us fight climate change. The ability of blue carbon habitats and ecosystems varies depending on the habitat and the species. Merle is a lovely example. We have live beds of this in our marine, in the marine protected area and no-take zone. And this seaweed is extremely slow growing. and has a calcium carbonate skeleton. As it grows, it captures carbon within its living plant tissues as well as its hard skeleton. As I say, extremely slow growing, about 1 millimetre a year, but these large marl beds are persistent, and over time they retain the carbon in this deep sediment of marl gravel that they accumulate. And it's estimated in the top 60 centimetres of Scottish marl beds that there's about 448,000 tonnes of carbon that is retained, although experts do say this is probably a gross underestimate. We've got seagrass in our marine protected area. It's suspected to be the largest seagrass meadow in the Firth of Clyde, and it's an area that's not just protected from bottom fishing, but also from creel fishing as well, so both mobile and static fishing. Seagrass, blue carbon potential of seagrass is quite an active area of research, but we do know that it sequesters carbon at a rate of about 1,000 tonnes a year. The majority of carbon in seagrass meadows is actually retained in the sediment, not in the living plants themselves. But the sediment structure and the root structure of seagrass is quite sensitive. So any sort of bottom fishing can destabilise this structure and release carbon back into the water and potentially back into the atmosphere. Kelp is slightly different. Kelp plants themselves are short-term carbon stores because every year the new plant is growing and that is where they store the carbon. However, the dead and decaying plant from the previous year's growth does sink down to deeper waters, and this therefore then contributes to the deep water sediment stores of carbon. And we know that kelp plants can sequester carbon at a rate of about 1.7 million tonnes per year. So there's a lot of habitats that we're lucky to have in the MPA that are helping humans and giving humans the benefit of carbon capture capabilities. But there's lots of other benefits us as humans get from these blue carbon habitats. They provide jobs and income to coastal communities through lots of different recreational opportunities and also by supporting fisheries. A lot of these ecosystems are biodiversity powerhouses. They provide nursery habitats for commercially important species as well. And not only that, they can provide a form of coastal protection and can improve water quality in the area. Blue carbon ecosystems, though, are under threat. Both anthropogenic and natural events can severely alter the capability of these ecosystems to store and retain carbon. Alarmingly, in a Scottish Government scoping report, there were 11 habitats identified as being particularly sensitive to bottom contact mobile fishing. 8 of these 11 habitats were identified as blue carbon habitats. And it's estimated that around 1.02 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide annually is released from degraded coastal ecosystems from bottom mobile fishing alone. But we can protect these ecosystems. The South Arran Marine Protected Area or marine protected areas in general are a way of protecting these ecosystems. It makes economic sense to protect blue carbon. In the UK, carbon sequestration is estimated to be about £57 billion annually. Our MPA alone captures around 8,000 tonnes per kilometre squared within its habitats, which totals to around 2.245 million tonnes of carbon in the whole MPA, which is quite staggering. We know MPAs can protect blue carbon ecosystems, but even better would be something like an inshore limit. Blue carbon ecosystems are one of the top nature-based solutions to climate change. And if we were to reinstate an inshore limit via just transition to our seas, we would protect the wealth of blue carbon ecosystems Scotland's inshore waters have. Doing this, we'd combat both climate change and biodiversity loss. And that is me. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Jenny. Really nice to have an example of how things can work in the kind of local context. And I would encourage you all to have a look at that RC's petition and the RC's website for some more information on the 3 nautical mile limit. So now we're going slightly further afield, and we've got a remote participant hopefully joining us on the screen. So we're very pleased to have Brian O'Riordan with us. He is the Executive Secretary of the Low Impact Fishers of Europe. So this is an umbrella organisation of organisations of small-scale, low-impact European fishers, and it works to provide them with a dedicated voice in policy. So Brian, hopefully you can hear us. We can see you. So please take it away.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Really happy to be here with you. I was really fascinated by those last two presentations, which really showed how enormously valuable, but how potentially vulnerable our inshore areas are. What a rich diversity of marine life they have in them, and how important that diversity is to the sustainability, not just of the oceans, but of the communities that live around the shore. I'd just like to start with a disclaimer. The Low Impact Fishers of Europe, or LIFE, is not anti-trawling. We believe that, well, our motto, in fact, is right gear, right time, right place. And there is a time and a place for trawling, but that needs to be defined clearly in inshore and offshore fishing policy. And in most countries, UK and more widely in Europe, we simply have a policy which allows trawling to take place everywhere without analysing what is the best place for trawling. And the other flip side of the coin is that the smaller scale, lower impact fishing activities, first of all, they couldn't access the deeper waters and the quantities of fish that are brought in by trawling and more intensive fishing activities. But the fact remains that these larger scale, what I would call mass production fishing activities, have implications not only for the sustainability of resources, but they have come to provide a component of what are inherently unsustainable food systems, which deliver fish products in about 80% of the cases through central supply chains to large retail outlets. In Europe, nearly 4 decades of successive common fisheries policies have created a distorted sea that promotes larger scale intensive fishing at the expense of smaller scale, lower impact fishing. And this has implications not only for the environment, but also for food security and the socioeconomic viability of many coastal communities. And the figures speak for themselves. 70% of the European fleet by vessel numbers, which provides 50% of the jobs at sea, are only allowed to catch 5% of what's landed. That's because at every turn, smaller scale, low impact fishing vessels have been discriminated against, both in terms of their access to resources and also in terms of their access to markets. The system used for allocating fishing opportunities in Europe has led to a concentration of fishing opportunities in the hands of relatively few larger scale companies. And that means that the smaller scale, lower impact fisheries increasingly have to fall back on what are known as non-quota species. They're those species, increasingly fewer in number, that are not actually subject to quota. As we've seen also, larger scale, more intensive fishing activities encroach on the fishing areas of smaller inshore fishing activities, carrying away their nets and other gears, reducing and damaging the seabed. In Europe, financial support for implementing the common fisheries policy has been used to provide perverse subsidies for the construction and modernization of larger and more powerful vessels, and to innovate fishing equipment so that it's ever more efficient at catching fish. It's something that we call technological creep. And every year, this technological creep is increasing the effectiveness of larger scale fishing operations to catch fish, which means less fish for smaller fishing operations and a need for fewer boats, fewer employment, but increasingly higher concentration of the ownership of the access rights, putting at risk a more equitable distribution of the benefits from fishing. The relatively larger catches from the trawling sector also have a depressing effect on prices, undermining the viability of smaller scale enterprises. So smaller scale enterprises, unlike the larger ones, have a relatively low value added that they make to their fishery product in terms of the very fresh quality of the fish. So we're talking of basically the daily catch. The fish is landed daily, it's in very high quality. It's caught using traditional methods, which are highly selective, and it's based on a shared maritime heritage. The fish that you find in the supermarkets generally is from the larger scale sector. It's produced massively, and the margins required to make a profit are much less than the margins required to make a profit in the smaller scale sector. So this price depression means that the value addition that the smaller scale sector provide is not recognized or respected. So who are the low impact fishers of Europe? We're a relatively new organization established in 2012 on the eve of the Common Fishing Policy. And the fishers came together in order to achieve a fairer fisheries scene, healthy seas, and vibrant communities. We currently have 32 life member organizations from 15 EU member states across all the sea basins, incorporating around 10,000 small-scale fishers. LIFE provides a dedicated voice for its members in the policy-making and decision-making processes at European level, and such a voice is needed given the bias of European policies towards larger scale, more intensive forms of fishing. So we would say that the small scale sector provide the cream of the catch. That's 5% of the catch, which supports 50,000 vessels, 70,000 fishers at sea, providing a very high quality fresh fish and a very large number of jobs ashore. Now, in recent years, the Common Fishing Policy has begun to consider the wider aspects, and the fisheries policy is very much part of what's called the European Green Deal, which is to provide carbon neutral Europe by 2050. But fishing is not just about the carbon. For sure, carbon is very important, but fishing is also about the environment and the structure of the environment. And one of the policy planks, if you like, of the Green Deal is the new biodiversity strategy and its particular targets for resource conservation and ecosystem protection, which envisages that the bottom impacting gears will be reduced over time. And the Commission, European Commission, is due to come up with an action plan on how they're going to achieve the various targets they've set themselves to reduce these bottom impacts. There also need to be some key policy and regulatory changes that LIFE is lobbying for. And as I mentioned earlier, what we're really calling for is a differentiated approach to inshore fishing and to offshore fishing. So we need a differentiated approach for smaller scale, lower impact fishing in order to enable the small scale fishers and the communities which depend on their catches to be able to access fairly the fishing resources on which they depend, and to be able to sell their products in ways that add value to them. And we want to protect the fishing areas from larger scale activities which they're currently not protected from. We also want to see a change in the way the food system operates. We would like to see a lot more decentralization and local emphasis put on the way that food is produced and consumed, so that you have a much closer connection between producers on the one hand and consumers on the other, and moving towards what we would call community-supported fisheries, where consumers and producers share the same basic value of wanting something that is produced fairly, something that is produced sustainably, something that corresponds to very high qualities of freshness and food safety, and something for which the consumers are prepared to pay a little bit more of. That means that in the future, we may have to consider that we will have to eat rather less fish and maybe pay rather more from it. And that if we want
Brian,
the
I'm
luxury
so
of
sorry.
having
Could you wrap up now,
low
please?
cost, if we want to have the luxury of having the low-cost fish, which is produced by the trawler fleet or the larger scale fleet on our supermarket shelves, then we may have to look at other more novel products like single-cell protein produced from the sea, seaweeds. But fish is a high-quality product.
Thank you so much, Brian. It was a really clear explanation of some of the more European and the policy issues that affect the systems there. So a really helpful kind of next step up from hearing the Scottish context. So we're going to scale up one more time. So we're going to go to West Africa. And we've got a pre-recorded presentation from Monsieur Guerrez. I'm going to say that wrong, I'm so sorry. He is the president of CALPA, which is the African Confederation of Artisanal Fisheries Organizations. And he's based in Senegal. So we have a recorded presentation and he will be joining us for the Q&A, and that's why we have the translation feature. So his presentation's in French, but with English subtitles.
Merci encore de nous avoir donné la parole. Donc je vais lire la déclaration de la COPA sur le salutage de fond sur les côtes africaines. La côte africaine, notre maison, notre lieu de travail, notre garde-manger est en péril. Le changement climatique créé par les activités des pays industrialisés érode aujourd'hui les zones côtières et emporte nos maisons. Le changement climatique provoque des tempêtes plus nombreuses qui font courir toujours plus de risques à nos pêcheurs. Les femmes transformatrices de poissons reviennent plus souvent de la plage avec le panier vide. Les poissons sont chaque jour moins nombreux, toujours plus petits et toujours plus chers. Le poisson, qui depuis toujours est notre filet de sécurité alimentaire, disparaît de l'assiette du consommateur africain. Mais si le poisson disparaît, c'est aussi à cause de la surpêche et des pratiques de pêche destructrices comme le salutage de fond dans les eaux côtières africaines. Les scientifiques nous disent que le salutage de fond réduit la productivité des fonds marins, conduit à une perte d'habitat halieutique essentiel et perturbe la structure et le fonctionnement des écosystèmes. Les scientifiques nous le disent, mais nous, pêcheurs artisans africains, nous voyons tous les jours les dégâts des chalutiers de fonds industriels dans nos zones de pêche. Dans certains pays africains, nous voyons même des chalutiers toutes les nuits venir pêcher illégalement, tout feu éteint, à quelques milles des plages. Les communautés de pêcheurs artisans du Congo, du Sénégal, du Kenya, à Madagascar, dénoncent amèrement des collisions quotidiennes, parfois meurtrières, avec des chalutiers qui pêchent illégalement dans la zone réservée à la pêche artisanale. Les engins lourds déployés par ces bateaux détruisent les filets des pêcheurs artisans et les propriétaires acceptent rarement de les indemniser. Personnellement, je ne connais aucun chalutier de fond industriel qui a été construit dans un pays tropical africain. Tous les chalutiers que nous voyons dans nos eaux viennent de la Chine, de Russie, d'Europe, de Corée. Ils rentrent dans nos eaux côtières, réputées riches en poissons grâce à de différents arrangements avec nos autorités, des affrètements, des repavillonnements de façades à travers des sociétés mixtes ou encore des accords de pêche. Sauf exception, les communautés de pêche artisanale africaines qui dépendent de la pêche pour vivre ne sont jamais consultées, ni même informées par nos dirigeants avant de faire venir ces bateaux qui souvent ne respectent pas les règles. Au Libéria, des chalutiers espagnols repavillonnés au Sénégal pillent les ressources de crevettes profondes dans la zone de pêche artisanale, sous le prétexte d'une pêche expérimentale. Au Sénégal, les chalutiers d'origine étrangère repavillonnés refusent systématiquement d'embarquer un observateur à bord. En Côte d'Ivoire, la plupart des chalutiers côtiers nationaux sont d'origine chinoise, pavillonnés ou affrétés localement. Ces chalutiers pêchent de façon non sélective, détruisent l'environnement côtier fragile, ne respectent pas les périodes de repos biologique et maltraitent leur équipage. Au non-respect de la nature se joint le non-respect des êtres humains. Aujourd'hui, nos communautés de pêche artisanale africaines se battent pour leur survie. Non seulement nous devons faire face à la crise provoquée par la Covid-19 et les restrictions qui ont été prises, mais nous devons aussi faire face aux conséquences sur nos océans des catastrophes provoquées par la cupidité de l'être humain, que ce soit la surpêche, les impacts du changement climatique ou encore l'exploitation pétrolière offshore. Nous survivons à tout cela, nous adopterons nos maisons, nos saisons de pêche, notre mode de vie. En 2022, c'est l'année internationale de la pêche et de l'aquaculture artisanale. Décrétée par les Nations Unies, ce sera l'occasion pour nous que nos décideurs montrent qu'ils ont pris pleinement conscience de l'importance de la pêche artisanale pour l'emploi, la sécurité alimentaire, le maintien des communautés côtières dynamiques imprégnées de la culture des gens de mer. L'une des priorités de l'organisation que je préside, la Confédération africaine des organisations professionnelles de la pêche artisanale, la COPA, c'est de demander à nos gouvernements des droits exclusifs d'accès à la zone côtière pour la pêche artisanale africaine dans les pays côtiers africains. Cela signifie faire sortir tous les chalutiers de la zone côtière. Nous voulons également que l'entièreté de cette zone côtière soit gérée avec les communautés de pêcheurs. L'écosystème côtier est notre maison. Qui peut mieux que nous peut garder cette maison en bon état avec de bons outils? Un de ces outils, c'est la surveillance participative. Il y a quelques années en Guinée, les pêcheurs avaient détecté plus de 400 incursions illégales de chalutiers dans leur zone de pêche. 12 pêcheurs avaient été blessés, perdus en mer ou décédés. Des patrouilleurs de surveillance par les pêcheurs artisans dans la zone ont permis de diminuer par 4 le nombre d'infractions enregistrées. Un autre de ces outils, ce sont des aires marines protégées, mais seulement si elles sont mises en place et gérées par les communautés locales et qu'elles s'inscrivent dans une dynamique de cogestion de la zone côtière par les communautés de pêcheurs. Nous ne voulons plus dans cette zone côtière de pratiques de pêche qui détruisent les écosystèmes côtiers fragiles dont nous dépendons pour vivre. Un chalutier de fond industriel qui pêche à quelques milles de la côte dans un pays tropical africain, c'est un éléphant dans un magasin de porcelaine. Nous ne pouvons plus accepter. Je vous remercie.
So much, Monsieur Gasso. So now we're going to move into the Q&A section. We have got quite a number of questions coming in online, and obviously it'd be great to hear from you guys in the room as well. So please take a few moments to think of questions. We just need to do a bit of tech in the background. So there's going to be a short animation about the work of life, just when we move over platforms. So we have a few minutes animation and then we'll jump straight into the Q&A.
Small-scale fishers have been the backbone of coastal communities across Europe for thousands of years. They normally do short trips, landing the freshest fish possible on a daily basis. Many of them are family businesses with the owner on board, following fishing traditions that care for the catch and the wider marine environment. Globalization has increased the demand for fish, putting strain on supply chains and fish stocks around the world, with some parts of the fishing industry historically taking too many fish too quickly, leading to some species dropping to dangerously low levels. This is no good for fish, fishermen, or the millions of people who rely on fish as an important part of their diet. Small-scale fishers are not the ones responsible for this overfishing because they commonly use the right gear, in the right place, at the right time. They are the stewards of the sea, not pirates. But instead of being rewarded for their sustainable approach, they get only a very small share of the fishing rights and have often been excluded from the decision-making process. Although no one can own the fish in the sea, fishing rights are increasingly being put up for sale to the highest bidder, often devastating coastal communities and leaving smaller-scale fishers without access to the fish on their doorstep. But things are changing. The LIFE platform has been established as a single, strong and inclusive voice to represent the interests of and champion small-scale, low-impact fishermen and women across Europe. We encourage and support our members to fish in a sustainable way using low-impact fishing techniques, meaning less discard and ensuring new generations of fish can thrive. And with 4 out of 5 boats in Europe being classed as small-scale, we have strength in numbers as well as unity. By working together with our member organisations, LIFE is able to develop common solutions to common problems, calling on the massive talent and combined experience of thousands of fishers across Europe. With recognition, support and fair access to resources, the smaller scale, low-impact fishers of Europe can be the solution to many of the problems facing the marine environment today. At LIFE, we want to be a gateway for a new generation of young fishers while preserving our traditional methods and values, ensuring a bright future for fishers and the sea through sustainable fishing.
Everybody, bit of a tech transition. Hopefully online you're in the right place now for the Q&A, and for those of you that are in the room, it'd be great to hear your questions. We've got a couple of additional panelists joining us for the Q&A. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Beatrice Guerrez. She is the spokesperson and coordinator of the Coalition for Fair Fisheries Arrangements. And actually, I can see a question in the chat here that kind of speaks to some of the issues that Beatrice